Hello students, today's video lecture is on the anatomy of the eye, part 2. Be sure that you have already watched part 1 so that you're not lost while I'm going over these bit more advanced structures. Okay, so previously we have learned that the eye is made of 3 layers, and this section up front is called the cornea. We've got a retina on the innermost surface of the eye that's light sensitive. Here's the optic nerve and the lens. All of that is still important, but in this diagram here, I'm concentrating on the different open spaces that are found within the eye. So these are called chambers. And as you can see for the title, the eye has 3 distinct chambers. So what we have is a ball shape that's hollow in the middle, and it's got the cornea that's sort of protruding out anteriorly or towards the front. Right behind the cornea, and you can see there's a thickness to the cornea right here, but right behind the cornea is the first of these open spaces or chambers, and because this is right out front, this is known as the anterior chamber. And the anterior chamber is filled with a watery fluid, and that fluid is called aqueous humor. Now, the purpose of that fluid is to help the cornea maintain its shape. We don't want it to get dented inward because that would disrupt our ability to focus the light rays. But also the fluid that fills this space gives nourishment to the cornea here and to the lens here. So I'm going to put a C for cornea and an L for lens just so we have that clarity there. Because neither one of these structures have their own blood supply. And so the aqueous humor in this space, which is constantly being produced and drained, replenished, provides nourishment for the cornea and the lens because they don't have their own blood supply. The second chamber is right behind the iris. So I'm going to put a blue line on each part of the iris here and here. That's the iris, and remember this would be the pupil here, the opening in the iris, but that space between the iris and the lens, it's a very tiny space, is called the posterior chamber. And the posterior chamber is also filled with aqueous humor, that same clear watery fluid. And actually the anterior and posterior chambers are connected by the pupil, so that fluid is produced back here and it goes through the posterior chamber and through the pupil and then drains at the top of the anterior and the bottom of the anterior chambers. So there's actually fluid flowing through the pupil kind of in this direction. Sort of a weird idea. Okay, so that's the posterior chamber up here between the iris and the lens, and then also down here, so I'm just going to label it one more time. And finally, the third open space is this giant open space behind the lens. And a lot of people will assume immediately that this is the posterior chamber because it's further back. But these two reference the position with regard to the iris. So anterior chamber in front of the iris, posterior directly behind it, and then this massive space is all on its own. Back here behind the lens, this is called the vitreous chamber. And this is one of the most interesting concepts of the entire body. This chamber is filled with a gel-like substance known as the vitreous gel. Some people may call it the vitreous humor, but I think it's more appropriate to call it the vitreous gel since it is actually a gel consistency. So I want you to think of like egg white before it's cooked when you crack an egg and the egg white is that like clear sort of thick gel. But instead of being runny and going everywhere, this would maintain its shape if we took it out of the eye. So I want to show you an image where the sclera and the choroid and the retina are all taken off, but the front of the eye is still intact. So if we look here, this is the iris, this is the pupil, this is the sclera, this is the ciliary body, and this blob of gel is this clear mass, that's the vitreous humor. So the whole back side of the eyeball was removed, and it maintains its shape. This is another picture of a cow eye that's been dissected, and we're looking at the back side of the ciliary body here. The iris would be like around the other side where we can't see. This is the lens. And you can even see the suspensory ligaments all the way around it, but notice what it's sitting on is this clear gel. That's the vitreous gel there, and then this is the sclera. So it is a really fascinating structure there, filling up the vitreous chamber and making sure that the retina, which is the innermost lining, stays totally flat against the back of the eye. So it provides pressure to keep that retina pressed up against the back of the eye. Okay, so let's talk about exactly where these are positioned. The anterior chamber is positioned between the cornea and the iris. The posterior chamber is positioned between the iris and the lens. Okay, so these descriptive words are with reference to the iris. And then we would say that the vitreous chamber is posterior or behind the lens. Okay, and for this blank, the aqueous humor that fills both the anterior and posterior chambers serves to, remember what I told you it did? It provides nourishment for the cornea and the lens because they lack their own blood vessels. And then the purpose of the vitreous gel that fills the vitreous chamber is to press the retina firmly against the back of the eye. Remember, the retina has the rods and cones in it. And so when the light comes in the eye, we need the retina to be nice and smooth in the back. If part of that retina detaches, your vision is going to be disrupted significantly. The other topic in today's lesson is we're going to talk about two special locations on the retina. And this is a photograph taken of the inside of the eye. So right through the pupil to the back of the retina. And actually this little spot right here is where the optic nerve connects in the back. And then this is another special location, and we can see there's all sorts of retinal blood vessels. So I'm just going to write the word retina in this picture. This is what the eye doctor would see if they looked inside your eye. And there's two special locations on the retina that we need to talk about, and actually one we've already talked about. So in your notes, the innermost layer of the eye is known as the retina. We know this already, and it contains the photoreceptors, special neurons that are sensitive to light, called rods and cones. And then remember, the rods are just, we use those in dim light, and the cones perceive our colors during the daytime bright light. So there's two spots on the retina that are actually functionally they're opposite of one another. So the first one I'm going to talk about is this spot right here, and it is sort of difficult to see, but you see how it's sort of darker? I'm going to outline it a little bit like this. It's sort of darker right here. That is known as the fovea. The fovea. And it's actually indented, so it's described as being pitted, although you can't tell from the front, but if you see a side view of the eye, see if they have one up here on this diagram. Not really. You see a side view of the eye, a lot of times the retina will just dip in right about here and then come back out, and that little dip right there, or pit, is what they're trying to represent as the fovea. So what's up with the fovea? It is exactly in line with the pupil. So when you look directly at something, the light from that object strikes the area of the retina called the fovea. But what is so special about it? Well, I'm going to highlight the next line because this is the big idea about the fovea. It provides your clearest color vision because it has the highest concentration of cone cells in the whole retina. So really what we're saying is there's cone cells out here in the rest of the retina, but most of them, almost like a geographic where everybody's congregated in the city. The fovea would be like the city where there is a significant density of cone cells here. So that means when we look right at something, we have the clearest color vision. And then the light that's striking out here away from the fovea is less crisp and less specific. So when we want to see something the best, we look right at it. So that's the fovea. The other spot on the retina is the functional opposite. So this is our best vision. This spot right here is actually a blind spot. In the notes, I'm going to write it's called the optic disc, which a lot of people just refer to it as their blind spot, is an area of the retina connected directly to the optic nerve. And a lot in part one, we learned that that's where the axons from all the rods and cones are converging and exiting the eye. So it's almost like how the eye would be plugged in right here, and there's no sensitive parts. So this area actually is functionally blind. So I'm going to go ahead and label that as the optic disc, and make sure I have labeled the other spot as the fovea. Okay, your task for the remainder or review of this lesson is to complete the other page of notes where you are matching the structure from the diagram to its description. So you're going to need both part 1 and part 2 notes to complete this.